So let's begin, and let me put my cards on the table. I don't like capitalism. I think the human race can do a lot better than capitalism, and I'm doing everything I can to move us along. I don't think socialism is particularly about the government. I would remind you that Marx, who wrote in great detail about all aspects of capitalism, never wrote a book about the government, barely wrote at all about the government. It was on his to-do list when he died. He never got to it. You know why? Because it wasn't a priority. The issue of the government came up in a very particular way in socialism. It came up as a strategic idea because the capitalists seemed to dominate the state most of the time, and both for offensive and defensive reasons, if we could snatch the state away from them, that would be a step forward. The interest in the state is not a part of the principle of socialism. It has to do with a strategic idea of how to move the society forward. Is it true that some societies grabbed the state, like the revolution in Russia, and then never made the transition, got stuck at that stage of the state? You bet. And that's a good criticism. But it's got nothing to do with socialism as an idea and as an alternative to capitalism. I also find it bizarre to think of capitalism and socialism in terms of governments and markets. And perhaps that's a key point to drive home. Slavery had markets. There's nothing unique about capitalism and markets. You remember American slavery? They bought and sold slaves. That's a market. They bought and sold cotton. That's a market. They bought and sold fill in the blank. So markets existed in slave society. Ditto in much of feudalism. Not always. Some parts of feudalism solved the coordination problem in different ways, not market ways. But markets coexist. So capitalism is not the system of markets because those long predate capitalism. Well, then what is capitalism? I would argue Marx, whose contribution strikes me as pivotal here, had a pretty clear definition that there are different ways human beings have organized the production of goods and services. That's different from how they circulate. Markets are about exchange and circulation, but Marx's focus was on production. So here's three basic ways in modern history. Slaves is one way. You have a master and a slave. Masters is a small group, slaves is a large group. Slaves do most of the work. Masters tell them what to do. Masters become rich and powerful. Slaves yearn for a better system. Then we have feudalism. How interesting. Different. No slavery. Nobody can own anybody. But you have a small group of people again, lords, and a large group of people who do all the work, serfs. And one interesting thing is that the serfs yearn to do better. Now we come to capitalism. It's different. And that's what's interesting. How is it different? Nobody is anybody's slave, and nobody has a personal obligation to another person the way a serf and a lord did. Instead, a contract links the two. There's an employer, a small group of people who tend to become rich and powerful, and a mass of employees, a large group of people who don't. Notice the parallel in these three systems. You might have thought, if you were all excited about capitalism, you might have believed the theorists of the capitalist revolution that they were breaking from all of the earlier systems. They were breaking from slavery. They were breaking from feudalism. And in important ways, they did. But there were equally important ways in which they didn't. And one of them was this division of people in production into a small group of people with all the power and wealth, telling all the others, the vast majority, what to do. A modern capitalist corporation is the most undemocratic institution I can imagine. You do what you are told, the majority. And if you don't, you lose your job and you lose your income. That's called compulsion. You know, if you really believed in democracy, the workplace is the first place you would have installed it. You know why? Because that's where adults spend most of their lives, working. 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day, they're on the job. Make the job democratic if you are believing in democracy. But you don't. You allow the owner or the shareholders or the major shareholders or the board of directors or some mix and match of all of them, a tiny minority, to dictate. to dictate to everybody else. No one person, one vote, no democratic decision what to produce and what not. My final point, this dichotomy between the government and the private sector, I find bizarre. In slavery, we had next to each other private slave enterprises, master and slaves, and the governments that existed from time to time in some slavery, they also had slaves. But nobody in my knowledge has ever suggested that it wasn't slavery because there was more or less of a balance between the private slave owners and the public ones. Ditto with feudalism. There were private feudalisms, and then there was the state, which also had serfs. So you had private feudalism and state feudalism. But we all deal with feudalism. And you know what? We don't give that much importance to the relationship between the state and the private. So we come to capitalism and we have a bizarre history. Suddenly, whether the capitalist employer is a private individual or a state entity becomes of enormous importance in a way it never was before. So I asked myself, why? We had a ready-made distinction between capitalism and what went before in terms of the master-slave dichotomy, the lord-serf dichotomy, and its differences and similarities with the employer-employee dichotomy. We don't need this weird discussion of the relative importance of the state. So my suspicion, that's all it is that that's a convenient deflector away from the core issue for those like me who see in the production relationship something that is fundamentally unacceptable, fundamentally undemocratic, and that which we can go beyond. Hence a socialism that emphasizes worker co-ops, because that is the alternative to master-slave, lord-serf, or employer-employee, because it finally brings democracy into the workplace, which I would argue was Marx's intent all along, at least in the sense that I make of his thinking. For me, socialism is a radically democratic reorganization of production. Whether the worker co-ops use market mechanisms to deal with one another, interspersed with non-market mechanisms, and I agree with Dr. Friedman, it's usually a mix, is a much secondary question to the radical social transformation that would occur if socialists had their way and made the democratic worker co-op the core production organization. Happily, that is already present in the world. And for those of you that are interested, the most successful example is the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. The second most successful example is the 40% of the economy of Emilia-Romagna, a province in Italy, where you can see how worker co-ops function and have functioned for many, many decades, so that the reality of them as a real alternative to capitalism is plentiful for anyone interested in looking at it. As to not saying my definition, I thought I gave my definition. For me, socialism is a production system, a way of arranging for the factories, the offices, and the stores to be organized democratically. One person, one vote to decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that everybody has helped. That's a radically different way of organizing production from slavery, feudalism, or capitalism. And for me, that's what socialism is mostly about. It is also a way to ground socialism so that whatever government does or does not appear, temporarily or not, has a control from below that makes it responsive to the people as a whole. They didn't do that in the Soviet Union. They didn't do it in China. Nor am I willing to be a Monday morning quarterback dismissing them, which is kind of silly as far as I can see. I expect that the early experiments in building socialism will have been experiments that teach people a great deal, both what to do and what not to do. Just like the early experiments in capitalism coming out of European feudalism included some that lasted weeks, some that lasted months and years before all the conditions were there to really make a social transition. Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, these are early experiments, how to do it, how to avoid problems. And we're learning, all of us. And part of what we've learned is that the macro focus, who owns the means of production, the focus on the government, lacks a micro foundation. And the transformation of the enterprise into a democratic institution is the kind of micro-focused transition that will make socialism not only more effective, learning from its experience, but it will be more attractive,